Hello. Hi, welcome to the second day of mapping fragments.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, can you
Welcome
hear
to the
me?
second day of the discussions. Um, I have just posted uh, a couple of questions that Saurabh Dubey sent as he will not be able to join us for the discussion. It's in the chat window. So there are two questions, and we'll come to these in the course of our discussion.
Okay.
Apart from that, we'll also talk about the current questions. So maybe I should recap what we discussed yesterday a little bit.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Because we spoke of how we perceive fragmentation and what its relationship to a larger unit was. And it seemed like we all arrived at the sense that the wholeness we referred to was transitory
Right.
and in some way related to the event of mapping. And what we
Yeah.
were mapping and leaving out uh, was also related to it in a kind of simultaneous way.
Okay.
Other than that, we also spoke of the idea of projection and how anticipation of hope and desire feeds the projection
Right.
and how it acts as a driving force um, for the event of mapping. And how mapping both forms the fragments as well as unites them or brings them together from different perspectives. So these were a couple of things that we spoke about yesterday. The question for today, the first question for today is, how does fragmentation get manifested? And I would like to um,
Hmm.
I was wondering if fragmentation gets manifested through identities or whether we could even look at physicalities of fragmentations in terms of how we carry scars or personas or masks. Can that also be a kind of fragmentation?
Hmm. But the interesting part about that is that especially in the question of identity and fragmentation,
Mm-hmm.
uh, uh, identity, so fragmentation and the process of the identity is like an image of certain kind. So identity is an image. It's an image that is, of course, utilized to be able to segregate citizens and population, and also
Mm-hmm.
in the political context to be able to uh, produce certain form of essentialization among different social groups. So, and in a way, fragmentation in the context of identity is a fragmentation that is produced, which similarly we discussed yesterday. But this is it's a production of an image that thereby translates itself as identity.
Right.
And the second question of whether fragmentation gets manifested through something. Uh,
Physicality is what I was wondering.
Physicality, that I'm not very sure
In,
of.
in terms of one's own, because there I'm trying to relate it to our question of how we are talking of fragmentation in the context of the self.
Yeah.
And although identity does play a role, what about identity in terms of, if you look at the fragment itself, what happens to personas that we may um, assume,
Hmm.
Personas
or
sound like they are fragments in a way. They are like cross
yes,
sections
yes,
because
yes.
personas are constructed either consciously or unconsciously in response maybe to something else. But if while wearing a persona, you are only being part of yourself in a way. So
Hmm.
that way, it's a fragment. So it's not the entirety of what you even think you are, even though you may not know exactly who you are entirely, but it's a section of you. So that's maybe that's one form of manifestation as a fractional self. And
Right.
the other thing about manifestation is it fragmentation can also manifest in how the self is relating to the event. So it's not only that the self is fragmented, but the self's relationship to the event could be fragmented.
Huh. Certainly, I think that's where she is absolutely right, that the self relationship to the event is fragmented because uh, even though it is perceived like that is like the identity's maybe relationship with the social like mobile, it is a fragmented part of conversation that you would like to have. And it's also more of thinking about oneself as a fragment to contribute in a larger conversation that is the event.
And also the perception of what the whole is could be fragmented.
Huh.
So
Right.
in the sense like obviously nobody is going to have the entire information. Like we talk about geopolitics, for example. I mean, there are certain projections given by certain people who have certain levels of power and who have agendas or whatever it is. So by definition, the perception of geopolitical events or whatever, to me at least, seems very fragmentary.
Right. We had an interesting response from Natasha Narayan, who was part of the conversation yesterday, but
Hmm.
sent us a response later. And she, I think, brings up this idea
Yeah.
of geopolitics because she talks about diaspora, and she said fragmentation to me is a breakdown with some level of violence or power and displacement involved. And
Mm-hmm.
fragmentation can also be in diasporic identities.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a very specific manifestation, certainly. Yeah, and
Right,
it's
right.
very and it's very all pervading. Like because diasporas are not necessarily somebody leaving a country going somewhere else. It could just be one stepping out of one's own home. That's you're already a diaspora in a way.
Mm.
And
But
and
also this idea of home
yeah,
is not very clear. It's
yeah,
not very
yeah.
it's not something that concrete.
No, it isn't. Yeah, that's right.
And I think that is where what we were talking of yesterday, the maps come into play as to what you're grouping into that identity, or how
Yeah.
you're aware of that fragment, how each fragment is in some ways self-aware to um, see what its role in the map is, maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's also something that Freya's ended at a very interesting note yesterday about this patterns, fragments as patterns,
Hmm.
and which is something to lead on to, to from that, because it's also about fragments as patterns, because places somewhere like produce an identity for themselves only in the process of this fragmentation, no? where
Right.
where the whole called the world or a country or a state is basically fragmented into manageable fragments,
Hmm.
so that a particular particular like infrastructure is instituted to be able to rule them or control them or run them.
Yeah.
So that way, the pattern of fragmentation, of course, is different, but it was quite something interesting to think about the idea of the patterns and how patterns and places are so related, and how fragmentation process becomes the channel through which these patterns in some way basically places become patterns of some kind.
Right. It's like you're placing a grid. You're placing like a filter on top of a given data set, and you're looking at that data set through that filter. So that's creating a certain type of pattern. So if you're
Absolutely.
placing like a filter of language, for example, and you're only taking that as the language map, that's
Yeah.
one way of grouping people, or it could be skin color, it could be whatever. So And there's various
So
ways of.
does that mean that see, in this case, the purpose of fragmenting or grouping is functional,
It could be functional, yes, for maybe like
in terms
governance,
of
for
for the
example.
ease, yeah, exactly, for the
Yeah.
ease of administration and governance.
Yeah.
Um, does it work in a similar way when we look at it in terms of one's own self-identity?
I think so. I mean, I think like the idea of compartmentalization, right? Like where we decide very specifically ki I like which is equivalent to the idea of a persona, where I'm going to only focus on these aspects of myself as is in a strategic way. That it in a way self-management is born through that, like in a way that's governance of the self, where I'm going to keep away my destructive tendencies at bay for some reason, and I'm only going to have my constructive aspects activated in a particular situation. I can make an active decision to do that. At, if I manage to understand myself well enough, where do I function and how do I function, and I only activate certain things of my, like if I go and have to give a speech,
Hmm.
like there's only some parts of me that I activate.
Hmm.
So that way it's like a placing a filter on myself.
Yeah, it's also just to lead on to that, it's also a form of like in politics, there is this whole process of essentializing
Hmm.
Yeah.
where different things come together. For example, in a mobilization that is basing on the idea of the caste. So suddenly
Hmm.
the caste factor of your identity comes to the fore to perform a certain kind of political function.
Right.
So in a way, similarly in the lecture context that you were just saying, because the
Hmm.
essentialization of what is the form of address or what is the form and function that I'm undertaking necessarily realigns the ways in which fragments speak to each other or adjust with each other.
Mm-hmm. Regarding the patterns, in fact, now I think I'll bring in Saurabh's question where he says we always have patterns in our mind. Everybody has different patterns of thought or arriving at a solution. So, what is important, the solution or the pattern through which we arrive at the solution? If yes, how is one more justifiable than the other?
Mm. So patterns and solution is what he's trying to arrive at in his
He's
Yeah.
trying to draw some sort of connection between how we think, and I think this is like what you were saying, Satya, how we sort our ideas and thoughts
Hmm.
out in when we are supposed to act in a certain circumstance or a particular
Yeah.
event.
And the question he's asking is, what is more important, the way we do that sorting, or is the end justified or the means justified?
yeah.
Yes, I think that's his question.
And especially in the context of the end, I don't know whether to think about something as a solution
Hmm.
has a very, very instrumental value, and I would say scientific value into it, where there is an equation that you have to solve and that becomes the solution through which it is addressed. I'm not very sure whether
But
you would.
also yesterday we were talking about how maps are never complete.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
in that sense, if the pattern is never complete and if there is never any solution to begin with,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm coming, whether it is the idea of the solution that is productive to think about, or it's the idea of consensus to think about that there is a particular historical point where there
Hmm.
is a consensus of yes, this is how we would like to fragment ourselves as
Yeah,
an
yeah,
identity, how fragment ourselves as a place,
yeah.
and there is a consensus on this is how we would like to exist, therefore we
Yeah.
move ahead, which lives in the perpetual idea of that there is a change that's going to happen in the future,
Right. Or
you
Right,
in
know.
or
right.
a good place is going to be reached in the future or something.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, I
So
think
in
so
that
New also says
uh,
something similar. He says algorithms follow a similar design, making sense of the noise, as it were. So, in a sense, mapping could be viewed as fragmentation, which is chopping data sets into chewable bits. Yet at the same
Absolutely.
time, it is also a process of integration, piecing
right.
together bits to create an intelligible model. or
Yeah.
maps, which is larger than the mere sum of its parts.
But how is it possible if fragments are never going to be organized in a pattern that's going to be complete?
Hmm.
And how is it possible to look towards the future with any sense of hope?
I think that hope is an ideal
What is the hope
state.
for?
Hope is to hope is for stability. Hope is for a creation of metastable states which take us towards
Mm.
the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. I mean, it's hope is for survival, really.
Yeah.
It's for
Oh,
coherence.
hope is it could also be an organizational hope.
Exactly.
Like for
Exactly.
administration, you just are trying to figure out the most efficient way of getting something done at that point of
But
time.
this whole tangent of administration
Hmm.
that's come up a couple of times today, but
Mm.
I don't understand it fully. So administration is from whose for whom? Like for whom is the system being administered? The because the system definitely doesn't want to administer itself because to be left to itself, it would be just existing. Any system would leave it, reach its optimal level of chaos.
No,
That's
So,
I don't agree there because I think we are talking of a certain human realm. Okay, so we already know if we talk of the self, there are certain inherent patterns of behavior that we gravitate towards, and we're talking of social communities and administering. So the same thing will apply, I feel, to um, in a more collective social context.
I
So I
But
don't
suppose
think
when
the
we
system
hello.
hello.
Sorry, there was some
something is getting
disturbance in
dropped
between.
out.
Yeah, I
yeah, I
think
think
Malvika
Saurav
is
is yeah
experiencing difficulty. No, you're there.
no I'm there.
Yeah. Actually, I think the when we talk about administration, like if we narrow the question down and be very crass about it in the sense, we talked about nation states some time ago. So
Yeah.
maybe at some point it might be worth going into a discussion of very concrete direction where we are talking about nation states, if
So,
Yes.
that's
are
of
we talking
interest.
about nation states? When we talk about administration, are we talking about nation states?
I'm just
Is
suggesting that maybe if it is of interest, we can consider going into something very specific like that.
So if you think of the state as a entity, for example, even the formation of the nation state,
Hmm.
and try to understand administration from that premise,
Hmm.
then the administration becomes the structural element through which the nation state exercises its power,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Which is completely different. For example, if you're talking about a person who is trying to uh, uh, organize or like basically adhere to a certain kind of uh, uh, activities that is making him a particular profession or like etc etc. So the if the my only point is whether administration is the way to think about
Hmm.
uh, yes, it is certainly the way to think about how nation states exercise power.
Yeah.
But what is the structure? Whether we are in a moment where the administration, as we understand, in the
Hmm.
formation of the nation state, is the same, or there is a different logic of administering things that persists.
So the way I'm seeing it is, at a fundamental level, there is a need for administration, even
Mm-hmm.
whether it be this, management. So whether it be the self or some other sort of organization, a nation state.
Mm-hmm.
So the I feel like when we talk about exercising power,
Mm-hmm.
ideally that's not what the administration of a nation state should ideally not be doing that. I mean, they are there for management and governance.
Hmm.
It's not necessarily for exercising power and control over a population.
but for management and governance, you
Yeah.
require power,
Yes,
right?
but yes, I agree. But there is this thing of power corrupting, that sort of thing. So when I think about exercising power, I'm thinking of it in a negative way. But as you said, it's not necessarily negative. You do need to use power um, in controlling or to
Yeah,
manage
yeah,
sections.
power is just maybe the order of priority that that an entity acquires in a system.
Hmm. Hierarchies of some sort.
But yeah, but in that sense, I'm not entirely sure if the evolution of hierarchies is
Hmm.
a synthetic process that happens in a system. It might
Hmm.
actually be a very natural occurrence.
Inherent.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
might be inherent. No,
And
but
it,
what I'm saying is that when in an ideal case with humans, the idea ideally as it has been preached, for example, by saints or whatever, is not about control or hatred, or that's not the idea fundamentally, but the way that has become exercised or manifested in reality is the opposite of that.
okay.
So I think there are some things about this we can carry into the second question for today, which is how do you develop distance in self-perception? Because if we're thinking of whether a system can, in some ways, monitor itself,
Yeah,
um,
correct.
Whether the
how do
system
you
can you repeat it? Sorry.
monitor itself?
Okay.
The question was, how do
But
we
self-management.
Hmm.
Self-management. The question is how do you develop distance in self-perception?
Okay.
Do we have any examples of self-management?
I mean, if you look at discipline, for example, if you have a routine, I get up in the morning, I do yoga, I drink grass juice or something, that sort of a structure, for example. That's sort of a self-management in a way.
Mm-hmm.
That's a, s-
But self-management is helping you. How is
Mhm.
it helping the system?
It is also helping in the sense of order. For example, if I'm in a 1984 kind of system,
Hmm.
my job is to turn on the monitor volume up at some point in my tiny cubicle. So if I've been mandated certain rules by the system and I'm following those rules,
Hmm.
then I am feeding into this. I'm helping the system.
But why is the system being seen as outside of the self? What can't the self also be seen as the system?
As part of the system or as a system
Yeah, because
itself,
when
I
you
think.
talk of discipline,
Yeah,
because then you are working, you are the system that you are working with.
correct. Which is what we were talking about, which is the response to what is self-management.
Yeah. But I think more than self-management, the question is actually the system itself, because we were just discussing about administration.
Hmm.
Whereas
Hmm.
administration has this authorial exercising of power when it actually in its structure.
Hmm.
Hmm.
System has a very like a lucid infrastructural tone to it that speaks about how basically things work, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Which is not necessarily a priori understanding that system is what exercises power, as opposed to
Yeah.
administration, where there is a big boss who's sitting on the top who's trying to administer things so that everything is fine. Whereas system, which is also relevant for something in like the working in digital and in the present, that system is where how things are channelized, how things communicate with each other, and how uh, things are compartmentalized into different sequences or different structures, etc., etc. So
Right.
system that way is more interesting, and it's when you come to the question of self from that system, it is about up to you. How do you like to position yourself within the possibilities that the system offers to you?
Right.
Which
So this is where the perception of the system is also important, as much as perception of the self is. So how
absolutely.
you perceive, because when you're talking of this, the issue of power,
Hmm.
then you're clearly power comes from a skewed sense of perception,
Yes.
or the imposing of power comes from a very skewed sense of perception. of either the system or the self.
Or it could be a very deliberate projection of something,
Or
of an
it
act.
could be, necessary. It could be a see. What do systems want to do? Systems want to preserve their state,
Coherence.
right?
Mm.
And to in order to for self-preservation, they might find it necessary to do something, and that might be seen as an application of power. But essentially, what any system will do at any given point is preserve itself.
Yeah.
Do you think it's preserve itself, or do you think it's updating itself? Because preserving,
I think
sustaining
it's preserving
sustainability and
itself.
preserve, huh?
No, actually, it's both. Because if you
Both.
preserve yourself, you are in a stable state, which then takes you to the next better state. So, in a way, as you said, it's updating. So, if the goal is to update, you have to have a stable place from which to
Structure,
operate
yes.
from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You will have to have a fundamental structure with on which the update actually happens, no?
Right. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Mm.
But the question, coming to the question, how does one develop distance in
Hmm.
self-perception? Because, and I think
But we have to qualify the distance. What is the distance? Whether it's the distance from the self, or whether it's the distance from the positioning of one's own self that it desires within a particular structure.
what if we take distance as a sense of objectivity?
That is certainly the case, because the idea of distance is fundamentally in the way we interact with the system. Okay, so you distance yourself from ABCD things because you would like to engage only with the many other, few other things,
But
not many other
isn't
things.
isn't distance just a suppression?
No, maybe
In what way?
it's a conversation to think. It is a point to think
You
where
suppress the
what convers
emotion.
no what conversation is. It's a choice of what conversation for you is relevant at a particular given time, as opposed to suppressing that and moving on to something else, I think.
But do we get to choose? You are saying that we get to choose what we find relevant, but then do we get to choose as such?
That's a
And
trick question.
it's a degrees, right? Like there are degrees of how much you get to choose. Like it depends on degrees of self-awareness. If you are really able to control that process of distancing, it is possible to do it. The process of compartmentalization in the mind, for example, like you're going through trauma, but you have to do this other thing. You can, to a certain extent, find a way to not suppress, but step away from the trauma, but do something else.
Yeah, it's a possibility of distraction in a way, no? Like it's not literally the same distraction, but to be able to think that okay, this is the stage, but this is a conversation that I have to have. So I
Hmm.
would like to produce a temporary
Yeah.
move away from it and try to achieve or try to articulate what I would like to say or what I would like to do.
Yeah.
But do you think that by creating that distance,
Hmm.
how, firstly, how do you distance yourself from the self? You know, how do you develop that distance?
Yeah.
No,
If we think
Yeah,
of, you
isn't
know, if we are thinking of it in the context of these fragments, you're already, you acknowledge that there are these many fragments. So can you completely distance yourself from um, the collection of fragments? Is there
but
a way of escaping it?
isn't distancing a kind of isn't it in the mind of the subject? So in the sense that isn't it fiction? Because
It could
uh,
be.
it could be. Mm.
It could
for
also
all
be
you
very
know, you are
physical.
immersed.
Yeah. It's also the idea, for example, the idea that there could be, even if we go back to the question of the place and the self, that there is a certain kind of a selfness that the self has, that the particular self establishes to a particular place, whatever place that is. Okay,
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
the somewhere the idea of the self at least lives in the fiction of a completeness. Okay,
Right.
this is
Right.
the place in
Yeah.
the world that is where I am complete in all my capacities. Okay,
Yeah.
whether it's physical, mental, all the possible capacities. So the idea of producing any distance from this
Hmm.
position of self within a place where
Hmm.
supposedly the fiction of the completeness is produced
Hmm.
is interesting. Then the friction is so much about whether the self is complete or not just because this distance is produced.
So are you saying that by altering the pattern, you can achieve distance?
I'm not, I'm saying I'm trying to make sense of the distance itself.
Because see, I am looking at it like this: that let's say, even if we take a physical location, we are situated in a certain city, and
Hmm.
we've gotten used to the patterns of that city and how we move around. And but if we want to view that city from a different perspective, we
Hmm.
would have to move out of it.
Absolutely.
So we would have to move out of it to experience another pattern in
Hmm.
order to see how this pattern compares. So in that sense, I'm
Compares.
thinking of altering the pattern of the fragments we that are actually making us understand the world.
Certainly the comparison, yes, but I also think that it's also the position of whether you would like to have a relocation of your fragments into a new idea of place because yeah, of various it is the distancing from the actual place that you think that is belongs to you, and suddenly you would like to have this relocation of your functioning into a new place just for the sake of thinking that you would like to think of both place and yourself as new. That also is a very
Yes, yes,
So
big
if
yes.
you see,
possibility.
if you see through the eyes of someone else, you don't have to move out of a place. If you are in a place long enough, it's you can still have a distance from it.
True, that is also true. It's also, yeah, it's also about the which perspective are we posing, what we choose to look at. Like for example, in a city, what is it we would like to choose to look at the city,
Exactly.
whether it's the morning sun
Right.
or the evening
Yeah,
sun or the moon.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's a whole bunch of all these things.
Yeah, and it's like which circles are you moving in? For right now, if you're in college, you're saying
Right.
certain things, but tomorrow something
Exactly.
else. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that again comes in a certain examination of that pattern that is already existing and say, okay, this is what is going on here, and I could change, I could remove a few components and maybe add something else to see what kind of a pattern it forms.
Hmm. But I think we can also talk about distancing within the self itself.
Yeah.
Right,
Where,
right.
nah, where
How
does
how is
actually
that going to happen without any differentiation that fragments the self into the self and the other? I mean, in the sense, how can you distance yourself from yourself without fragmenting and differentiating?
No, fragmenting is definitely the process. I don't think
Yeah.
fragmenting is excluded from it. But what I'm saying is there is only at a particular moment that the fragment of the self is chosen to be considered. Whereas always you're actually in the perpetual thing of trying to find a wholeness, a fictional whole to what you are.
Right, right, right. Like
Okay,
I was yeah, like I was
sorry.
talking about seeing yourself through the eyes of another, for example. So
Mm.
you are wearing a persona, and in that sense, you are fragmenting yourself, and you're looking at yourself through a new way of looking at yourself. That's a distance.
Yeah. So, considering what are the I mean, I'm just saying, what are the benefits of fragmentation as opposed to uh, really being able to deal with all the contradictory, urges within one's own integrated self.
It's to basically do damage control. To be able to
Yes.
basically to be able to negotiate, to be able to not literally, I was not like being just provocative, not to be actually to the moment of collapse of any kind, whether it's an intellectual collapse or whatever collapse, where you're basically not able to read the context that is in front of you within any of the faculty, whether it's the physical faculty or the intellectual faculty or both simultaneously.
So fragmenting is never a positive thing.
No,
No,
fragmenting
it
is
is.
a
It
positive
is.
thing.
It is.
Fragmenting is the process through which you can actually try to find ways of engaging with yourself, because you can't deal with the intensity that the whole like basically burdens you with.
I also think that if we look at fragmenting of the self as, like you mentioned a little while earlier, Prayas, of the differentiation between the fragments of yourself and the other. I think I wouldn't necessarily look at it as the other, where the moment you are fragmenting yourself, there are many selves, and it depends on which lot of selves you're actually with. Um, so I don't know. The question of the other is in some ways too much of a polemic.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I think the advantages of fragmentation is to also reduce the distance from such the creation of extreme opposites, where you somewhere understand that you're only a part of
It
many.
it blurs the relationship between the inside and the outside that you so
Right,
used to,
right.
exist within.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it makes that way more complicated and interesting. Uh,
Right.
because then you're not necessarily trying to deal with in this as like by yourself, but
Yeah.
actually in the presence of others that you either fictional or real. That's a different conversation. But
Right.
the idea of a presence of some kind, it can be a presence of a place also.
The presence of a place. You're talking of the fragments. The idea of the
That's when
fragments relate to the idea of a presence, or
no, I'm talking about the fragments as an as producing the idea.
okay, okay.
Presence of others, not necessarily the self.
So when you talk of this idea of a presence, that means you are again uh, moving towards some sort of a mapping of those fragments.
Perhaps, yes.
So,
Temporary.
so the third question we have for today is, what does a map do?
What does a map do?
What does a map do, and how does it do what it does?
What does a map do, and
How does it
how
do what it does, and how? How does it do it?
what does a map do?
Firstly, yeah, what does a map do?
Right.
And we spoke about this a little bit yesterday in terms of a map being taking the place of an event.
Yeah.
Um, but how does it do it?
So can a map create distance?
I think the map is all about measuring distance.
Measuring distance.
Or basically one is to segregate geographies, and of course, which is the literal thing, and also is also measuring distance between these so-called identified geographies.
Is it measuring or is it creating distance?
Creating, yes, maybe both simultaneous, creating and measuring simultaneously.
Right. Because yes, I can see how it is measuring. In the sense, for me, creating distance is like if I draw a map, I'm dividing up spaces, and I'm saying this place is this far away from this other space.
Yeah. But the
But
measure is also the process, as you say.
yes, exactly, the measurement. But at the same time, by drawing the boundaries of the map, I'm saying that this place is falling within the boundary of this other space. Therefore, these two are closer to each other.
Yeah.
Nu just made a comment saying map is to identify topography, physical and mental.
Hmm.
Map is to
So
identify topography. Yeah, I mean, at a very generic level, yeah, that's what maps do. We sort of try to talk about the contours of a space
But do
and
they do maps identify or do they represent what is identified?
is it isn't identification a part of representation? Like you have to sort of work on identifying first
Yeah.
and
So
then
that it
represent.
becomes a object of or name. It
Yeah,
becomes a place. So basically, in barren land is being is made into a place with a name only through the process of identification, and then it becoming to, so you are identified as this, therefore from tomorrow you will be representing this.
yeah.
so is that identification in relation to its character or in relation to where it is in terms of because what I'm thinking of is if you're looking at mapping barren lands all over the world, then you will get a very different map. And
Yeah.
if you're looking
Absolutely.
at a barren land in, say, a specific region,
Hmm.
you're going to find a different kind. So, and if you apply the same to, say, communities or people, uh, you're going to get different kinds of maps when you are looking at, say, uh, mapping children of a certain
Hmm.
kind, or mapping.
I think it's
What if
also
you map
depends on,
emotions?
it depends upon the, for example, in the context of a place, of course, there is always a, possibility of mapping in imaginary. People try to speculate this thing that, a particular era, try to imagine about the past and the present in certain way, etc., etc. But in the context of place, I
Mm.
think it's the identification also is an analysis that tries to uh, basically explorate what is the possibility that the place is offering. What are the, I'm not saying in terms of resources, but
Yeah.
what is the potential of the space? So the potential of the space becomes the fundamental question within which the identification process is internally hierarchized in a way, no?
Yeah, actually, when we talk about topography, that's more reasonable because we are not imposing anything. We are just doing a survey of the place. We're just like saying this is how it is.
Yeah.
So, in
Which
that
is,
sense, maps are distancing agencies. They are in some ways surveys, that they're not so much
They can be. Yeah, they can be because there's two types of maps now. One is where you're trying to represent to the best of your own ability what you are sensing. And there is the other type of mapping where you are applying some lenses which come from some other place of maybe an agenda or maybe a place of power or whatever. And you're trying to impose that.
hmm.
and
So
also,
go ahead.
sorry, just to think about maps in the present, because we are also talking about maps then when the mapping process has begun. But map in the present is also so much to do with the movement of what is the a big question of mapping for the sake of extra mobility in an extremely accelerated way than before. Of course, at some point, maps were made to understand how do we navigate from here to there.
Right?
But now the equation is so complicated that maps basically track the movement of your bodies, no,
True, true.
everywhere,
Still, but yet
everywhere.
it is still, if it is just a tracking, it is still similar. It's still a survey of how you're moving.
Absolutely.
Um,
But what
Yeah,
it does
this
with the tracking is a different conversation.
yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. That's the other place of where what is the agenda of the movement and why are these migrations happening, etc.
Absolutely, yeah, that's true.
So yesterday we spoke of how mapping is in some ways the event, and the event itself is transitory, and which means if the mapping is also in some ways related to time and movement,
Yeah.
how does a moving thing map other moving things?
And I think in that there is the device of metastability in the sense of having a snapshot which we hold on to for a little while until it changes so much that there is a need to redraw it. So we have a device of holding on to something because we need stability
So
to
it's
build
like a
up bond.
photograph. It's like a photograph
Yeah.
of a dynamic system.
Yeah, a snapshot, a cross section.
So a question that just occurred to me is, how do we map something like conflict? Because we're talking of fragments, we're talking of the different cells, we're talking of, you know, parts and things trying to come together or not coming together, and the, the times of friction when that all this causes. Um, how can we relate it to mapping conflicts?
And so then we can, I'm thinking how to map conflict could be looking for certain indicators, so certain temperature points, so for example, the casualties. If I'm making a map of casualties, that can indicate to me something else. If I am mapping migration, that is indicating to me. So I guess from a very practical point of view, we take temperature at different points, and we have sensors of different sorts at different points in a soup, and then it gives you a shape of that soup. And if what does it mean to map a conflict? Like what are we trying to look at?
Um,
We're trying to make sense of the conflict, right? So
Yes.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But what is
So
the question through which? Sorry, you go ahead. I interrupted you.
no, I was just reiterating the point that we are essentially trying to make
Sense of a conflict.
sense of the conflict.
No, if you are asking about making sense of the conflict, it's also about where does one stand in the conflict. That's the most important question. And whether you are trying to have a bird eye view of the conflict, or whether you are talking about as the person who's standing inside the conflict and speaking, or you are the one who is looking back at the conflict that has already happened,
Yeah.
to be able to produce some kind of a hypothesis of how can you map it.
Or
Because
even
mapping
sorry.
is a process which presumes that there is an aerial view that's possible.
Yeah, a
Whether,
distance.
and in the context of the conflict, it's very difficult whether that aerial view is possible or not. So whether we have the luxury of that aerial view.
Yeah,
Because
and
of,
if somebody
But
who
is
does
aerial
have
view
the
a
luxury,
luxury?
yes, it
What?
can be,
Why?
because you're not in it. If you're on the ground and you're the one being shot at, then you don't have necessarily the luxury of the
yeah,
aerial.
and that's the distance. That then we are going back to the question of the distance. So
But
whether
you
you
may
are,
be missing out something by not being
Hmm.
in the conflict. You
Exactly,
may not
you
know
are exactly,
yeah,
and that's where the
the ground
privilege comes.
reality. Yeah.
Absolutely, which is why we talk about journalistic privilege, and we talk about like colonialist interpretations of what's going on the ground. Like you're speaking from an ivory tower,
exactly. And
Yeah,
for you,
that,
it's
but
also an image.
and that's
but
not
the importance of
necessarily.
personal histories.
Hmm?
What about the
So,
role of personal histories? The one
so,
who has been through the conflict.
Right, and that's another map. That's so. I guess time also provides a distance. So there's one way of.
so
Uh,
this must mean that we, for some reason, we prioritize the representation of the pattern over the experience of the pattern.
we prioritize. No, that's the only thing we can do. See, in the
So
moment,
because from the ivory tower, what you can have is a sense of perspective. You can maybe observe the entire pattern.
You have the distance basically
You
to
have,
be
Yeah, you
able
have
to.
the
yeah,
distance,
and
but
you have
you don't
the
have the
capacity.
experience.
Maybe not, but you have the capacity to do it because you are using a different part of your brain when you're sitting in the ivory tower. I don't mean to be condescending or whatever, but if you look at it very objectively, you're at a distance where you're not in the moment and you're not in a fight or flight mode. So you can actually sort of represent it. And even when you're inside the conflict, it doesn't mean that you don't have your faculties all there. I mean, even while you're in there, you have a very different perspective of that locality where you are and how things are happening over there. And as Malvika, you said, yeah, something is lost. If you're not in it, then you're not seeing that. At the personal histories, you don't have access to that. So maybe everyone has their own cross section of it.
Yeah, so as I'm thinking of mapping being a kind of objective process,
Hmm.
but can the mapping, the process of mapping, include these multiple perspectives, which
Yeah.
means then the mapping itself also has fragments.
Yeah.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, and funny thing is sometimes when you distance away because of time from an event, there is a better perspective of an understanding of why something happened. Why did that conflict happen, or at that moment, why did that person take that decision?
Absolutely.
But
But
you seem
that
to be
objectivity is
suggesting
only
that the distance perspective is in some ways more progressive.
Not necessarily. It's just a different. I'm not giving priority to anything. Like I don't believe that. I think it's just that the information that's available to make a pattern
Is more.
is the distance gives a component which adds to the information. Whereas while you're in the situation, while you're experiencing it, that information is lost when you have distanced yourself.
But it's also maybe the question of being in the conflict, which is very interesting for me to think about whether it is the point where your preconceived pattern is challenged, as opposed to you being in the ivory tower and watching the
Right, right, right.
you know. So the
Yeah.
idea of being in this, I'm not saying valorizing any of those, but I'm trying to say that the very dynamic of you being within a conflict as a
Hmm.
participant and be extremely spontaneous to everything that is happening, not
Yeah.
Hmm.
necessarily always like a state exercising power onto you, but the very moment then tries to make you, force you to go out of the pattern of your
Yeah.
imagination and then try to do something else, and then the pattern of what you think you had actually either failed or reinvented in the process.
Yeah. And
Also,
like
you're stuck in the moment of things happening and changing as you live in that place, as opposed to something that becomes reportage.
Yeah, the
So
idea
there is a
of
certain privilege there also.
which is what I was saying, that there is definitely a privilege.
yeah, yeah. It's also the question of, simple question of the spectator and the participant, no?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
it's the role you would like to choose, whether you want to be the spectator of and perceive it as a spectacle, because for many people it's not a spectacle, it's something that they have to participate to be able to claim what they have for them, no?
yeah. And sometimes there is no choice. Sometimes
There's
you're,
no choice.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes there are moments where these things blur because the spectator
yeah,
might not have that luxury, actually has to become a
yeah.
participant by the
But
virtue of the dynamic of how the scene unfolds.
exactly,
So it's very, very murky
yeah.
in
But
that
what
way.
to do with privilege if it exists by default? Is
There,
it not to be accepted?
see,
No, how
anything
I'm
has
thinking
to be.
of, yeah, yeah.
Sorry, anything. It is better to accept that something exists. It does exist, and it's
Yeah.
better to admit it and to acknowledge it. It is important to do that.
I think it's also important to look at privilege in terms of how the different privileges can be accommodated.
Hmm.
Whether they
And
should be, or whether they should be accommodated. Like, yeah,
No, the important question is about, maybe it's not the question of the privilege, but even if you go back to the question of objectivity and the translation of what you see,
hmm,
which is what basically we are discussing about, as opposed to the question of not being able to participate in the conflict, but at the same time speak about it, which are two different things, because you're not participating in it because A, you don't relate to it, and also you choose to be the spectator of it and not really. Hello?
Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear
Okay.
you.
So that's the question, because then I don't know whether it's the question of the privilege or whether it's the question of uh, that's how the structure allows it to happen.
Um, yeah, so I'm trying to envision a kind of structure that can um that has the option of looking at the multi-layered map. I mean, to take an example of just normal Google Maps and how it functions, what if when you looked at it from a certain perspective, you saw a certain map, and when you zoomed in, you saw a very different map, and
Mm-hmm.
and it's not that one is um, untrue and the other is true, but they're both true in their own perspectives and in their own sense. And whether
But
these multi levels or these layers can coexist is something that I'm thinking of in terms of the process of mapping.
it's important to think about, if you were to think about mapping as a conceptual practice,
Yes, yes.
as opposed to mapping as the geological practice. The important thing is about how do you understand the process of mapping that is not simulating the geographies.
Right.
So if we were to think about mapping as a process that is not simulating the geographies, which is what its conventional process has been, then
Mm.
we are actually entering a new field of thinking about what are the possibilities that mapping and vis-a-vis its perception of the world, not necessarily as a geography,
Yes,
then
exactly.
does. So that is
Yeah.
the mapping fragments in that way comes together there, because then you're not just talking about mapping as an instrumental structure that has a codified way of approaching a geography, but as something way more diverse and tangential than just like as a mere process of like segregating territories.
I mean, we talked about applying lenses and filters
Mm,
on
mm.
a very same data set, which geographically that data set has a certain import. But if you applied a conceptual map, a conceptual filter, you're getting a different map, a filter. If so you're looking at the same thing from various perspectives. So one is a
Yeah,
very physical
but
survey.
but I would like to question the fact that is it at all possible to look at a map
Hmm.
and outside of its geospatial kind of
Yes,
you
you
know
can. Yeah,
That's what I'm trying
absolutely
to
you
say.
can. I mean,
That's
if
what
you
I'm
have a
trying to say.
map of India, and for example, and you're taking the city names of cities which are all laid out on it, you can absolutely apply another map which says which all cities have the letter X in it.
no, but that's basically maybe you're doing information design or something. But I'm
No,
saying
no,
that
no, no. I don't. It's just a trivial example.
but
I don't want.
isn't the word map
Hmm.
and how we associate with the word presupposes a particular kind of history of the word and its
Not
application before.
No, not necessarily. You can get new information, right? Like you're looking at stuff and you're seeing a new pattern. Why is it doesn't okay now that looking at the new pattern could be presupposed because of a history in the past or way of thinking.
I'm also looking at the map within its. I mean, if you take the geographical map and looking at it with the geography and beyond. So you at one level are looking at the geographical map, and then at another level you're looking at where the geographical map blurs and it flows into other things that may not necessarily stick to its geographical boundaries.
Exactly, like if you take language, for example, like you're taking
Yeah, yeah.
dialects. So it could be anything like skin color I said earlier. You're specifically looking for one shade, which is a
Yeah.
distribution across the whole entire geography. Then that's a completely another map.
It's also
So
about the
we have, yeah.
procedures of mapping in terms of thinking about what are the different procedures through which mapping as such can be thought about, and whether that is the opportunity to diversify the conversation about map as such and the multiple things it offers to think about the present.
Right. I'm afraid we're going to have to stop for today because it's already been an hour. But thank you, everybody, and we hope to see you all tomorrow. We'll post the link for the Hangout and we'll send it to whoever's participating. So thanks once again.
Thank you.
Okay.